Continuing our discussion on the causes behind the outbreak of the Second World War, we come to the cause of the policy of appeasement. Not only is this a cause behind the Second World War, it is also an answer to many of the questions that might have popped up in your minds when you were discussing the various other causes. Questions such as why were the Allied nations not reacting to the totalitarian ideologies rising up in Italy and Germany, and why were they not putting a stop to their aggressive expansions? By understanding the policy of appeasement, we would be able to answer these questions. Before answering such questions, we have to understand what was the policy of appeasement. The policy of appeasement was a policy followed by the Allied nations, particularly Britain and France, which involved acceding or agreeing onto certain hostile or unfriendly demands made particularly by the Axis powers, and this was done in order to gain peace and save the world from war. Let me paint you a picture. Suppose there is some argumentation between you and your mother ends up scolding you a lot, which upsets you. Your mother realizes later that she should not have scolded you so much, and therefore she decides to make your favorite dish for dinner. When you come down for dinner, you are happy with the food she provides you, and you are no longer upset with her. Your mother tries to appease you with the favorite dish so that you do not hold grudge against her for the argumentation and her scolding you. You see, during appeasement, one party tries to appease the other by accepting various demands of the party so that further conflict could be avoided and peace could be maintained. You see, a similar thing happened in Europe in 1937 when Britain adopted a policy of appeasement, where it accepted that it would accede to various demands made by other nations such as Germany in order to avoid any forms of war and to maintain peace. But why did the Allied nations really follow the policy of appeasement? What really made them follow such a policy? Let's understand that. You see, during this period, the Allied nations for the first time came to a realization they hadn't come to before. At the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the very terms they had imposed on nations like Germany and Italy were actually unfair. And therefore they realized that the Treaty of Versailles had been too severe on the defeated powers and the other powers which were affected by the treaty. And they also came to a realization where they thought that the discontentment showcased by the people of these countries was not fair. And they also came to a realization where they felt the discontentment showcased by the people of these countries was not unfair, as they were only demanding for what they had lost. And therefore decided to justify the various German and Italian bitternesses, and also how this bitterness was turned into aggressive policies of expansions. You see, in many ways, the Allied nations felt guilty for what they did after the First World War. Now that new governments had been established in these Allied nations, they came to a realization that their predecessors had been too revanchist or too revenge-driven in their approach. And now the bitterness exhibited by these Axis powers and their public is not unfair. Therefore, they decided to overlook various expansions made by these nations. Best example is when Hitler decided to march into Rhineland and remilitarize it. The Allied nations could have easily stopped Hitler right there. But they also felt that the demilitarization of Rhineland in the first place was wrong, as it was a German territory. Therefore, we understand that out of guilt, in many ways, they wanted to follow a policy of appeasement. The second reason they wanted to follow a policy of appeasement was a reason they thought is too simple to understand. They came to a natural understanding that many of the grievances exhibited by the people of discontented nations are fair. They just want some of their grievances met. So the Allied nations felt that if they could go forward and meet some of these grievances, the people of the nations would be satisfied and the nations would not pose any sort of threat to world peace. Thus, in order to maintain world peace, they decided that through the policy of appeasement, if they meet many of the grievances, these nations would be satisfied. Another reason to follow a policy of appeasement was because they wanted an insurance policy of sorts. They thought that if such a policy is being followed, these discontented nations, which now were following aggressive expansionist policies, would not attack their own territories and the colonial interests of the allied nations. Just to keep safe their own territories and to also secure their colonies, the allied nations pursued the policy of appeasement as an insurance policy. This map over here demonstrates the colonial possessions of various powers in the year 1938. So we see that the primary allied nations of Europe, namely UK, which is marked in the color red, has many strategic territories and colonies such as India, major portions of Africa, and also certain portions of Southeast Asia, North America, and Latin America. France as well, denoted by the blue color, also had a lot of territories in Africa, Southeast Asia, and also in some parts of Latin America and the Middle East. Therefore, these nations had a lot of colonies to worry about, while the Axis nations were following aggressive expansions of their own. Therefore, to keep their own colonies secure and their very territory safe, they had to follow the policy of appeasement. Finally, and most importantly, the policy of appeasement was a product of the three-pronged clash of ideologies between capitalism, followed by the allied nations, fascism and Nazism, followed by the Axis powers, and communism, followed by Soviet Russia and China. You see, the allied nations wanted to use the Axis powers and thus let the expansions of the Axis powers continue so as the rising tide of communism and that of Russia itself could be brought under check. You see, the allied nations did not want to get into any form of direct conflict with the communist power of Russia. What the allied nations wanted instead is for the Axis powers to go ahead and fight against the communist powers, namely Russia and China, so that both of these groups get engaged in conflict and eventually get weakened, as any form of conflict always leads to devastation on both sides. So we understand the true intention of the policy of appeasement. It was a way to resist the rising power of communism, and by that they let the Axis powers continue with their expansions, as they considered communism to be a greater threat and thought that they could easily control the Axis powers if they ever become a threat. For all these reasons, finally the British Prime Minister of that time, Neville Chamberlain, of whom we can see a picture over here, adopted the policy of appeasement in the year 1937. This policy lasted in the period between May 1937 all the way to September 1939. When the British adopted this policy, it also inspired the allied nation of France to make this policy a crucial part of its own foreign policy. And in fact, this policy of appeasement became the base of foreign policy of France and Britain towards the Axis powers in the 1930s. And through this policy, the allied nations extended political concessions or accepted various political demands made by the Axis powers to avoid any form of military confrontation or any form of war or conflict between the Axis nations and the allied nations. Over here we see a picture of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain visiting Germany, one of the many visits he did while he was following the policy of appeasement. Now let us look at some instances of the application of the policy of appeasement. Starting with the Gentleman's Agreement is applicable between the period of 1937 and 38. This agreement was signed between Britain and France on one end and Italy on the other. This particular agreement remains one of the best instances of the policy of appeasement. According to this treaty, Italy was allowed to pursue its African interest, or Italy was allowed to pursue its expansions in Africa. But in exchange, Italy had to give access to the entire Mediterranean region, and this access was to be given to all European powers. Therefore, by the Gentleman's Agreement, the allied nations let Italy pursue its expansions in Africa and in exchange managed to keep the Mediterranean region open for Europe and European trade. But perhaps some of the most recognizable symbols or instances of the policy of appeasement remains the Munich Pact of 1939. The Munich Pact was signed between Britain and France on one side and Germany or Nazi Germany on the other. We can see the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain shaking hands with Hitler during the signing of the Munich Pact of 1939. Can you answer this question? When was the Munich Pact signed? 1939, 1938, 1937 or 1940? The correct answer is 1939. But what was the Munich Pact all about? According to this pact, Germany was allowed to take over Sudetenland. You can see that region marked in red. This particular region was a part of Czechoslovakia, and it was a German populated region of Czechoslovakia which was given to Czechoslovakia after the First World War. Hitler had his eyes on this region and wanted it to be a part of Germany. When both Hitler and the Czechoslovakian leader approached the Allied nations decided to appease to Hitler's Germany, and it allowed Germany to take over Sudetenland, but in exchange, Hitler was to give a pledge of peace. He was to state that he would not cause such aggressions in the future, and he would establish peace with the Allied nations. When Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich after signing the Munich Pact, he victoriously waved a piece of paper in which Hitler had declared that peace would be maintained. This Chamberlain said that peace in our time has been achieved. This was considered to be a very victorious step back at that time. This was considered to be a victorious step at this time because the Allied nations felt that any threat of war from the Axis powers had been effectively eliminated. Little did they know that Hitler's promises were hollow, and soon the time shall run out on this peace. We already could understand that the policy of appeasement was not a success. Otherwise, we would not be knowing about the policy while discussing the causes behind the Second World War. Therefore, let us understand where did the policy of appeasement actually go wrong. Have you heard the saying, the early bird gets the worm? That was the case of the policy of appeasement. Do you remember when was the Treaty of Versailles signed? In the year 1919. The Treaty of Versailles led to immense discontentment among the people of the nations the treaty applied to, especially Germany. The Allied nations had roughly 10 years to withdraw the unfair terms of the Treaty of Versailles, to release the tension from these nations and to satisfy the people of these nations. You see, the Allied nations did not act. They did not act when the youth of these nations went from street to street begging for a decent job. They did not act when a single loaf of bread costed 100 billion German marks. They did not act when thousands died out of hunger. And they did not act when families were separated by haphazardly drawn border lines. When the Allied nations did not act, the people of these nations themselves did. And they voted to power totalitarian and aggressive nationalist leaders who promised them that they will get whatever they wanted and demanded. The Allied nations finally adopted the policy of appeasement in the year 1937. And by this time, the nations of Germany and Italy already were under the leadership of aggressive nationalists and totalitarian ideologies, and already began their journey on a path of economic and military prosperity. Therefore, the policy of appeasement came at a wrong time, and it came too late. You see, by this time, Hitler and Mussolini had taken the worm. The worm in this case being a chance of ensuring peace. The policy of appeasement was also adopted on a very simple understanding, that if the grievances of the people of these discontented countries are met, they would be satisfied and they would not continue with aggressions. Now, this is a fair assessment, but not when the people who are being assessed are aggressive and militant nationalists like Hitler and Mussolini. You see, for Hitler and Mussolini, expansion and imperialism was essential for a nation to survive. And they considered things like peace and negotiations to be weak concepts. Thus, this assessment made by the Allied nations of accepting grievances to ensure peace turned out to be a shocking mistake, as the people who were being assessed, the leaders of these nations, Hitler and Mussolini, had no intention of stopping their expansions. Giving or meeting some of their demands was like putting a piece of meat in front of a hungry and untamed lion. What do you think the untamed lion will do? Will it be satisfied with that piece of meat, or will it pounce upon you? That's exactly what happened. The piece of meat or the limited demands did not satisfy these nations, and their demands kept on increasing. Thus, the policy of appeasement was bound to be exploited by the Axis nations. You see, these hungry lions, the Axis nations, were not to be contented when the Allied nations would only accept some limited demands. They had their eyes for much. Their ambitions were much bigger. We can take an example over here. When the Allies allowed Hitler to annex Sudetenland, Hitler then went on to demand the entirety of Czechoslovakia. Now, despite the insistence from the Czechoslovakian leader that please do not give us to Hitler, the Allied nations still appeased Hitler and let him annex the entirety of Czechoslovakia, thinking that this would truly be Germany's last demand. As you can already understand, that was not to be the case. The Axis nations had much broader ambitions. Germany wanted to take over the entirety of Europe. Italy wanted to achieve its supremacy over the Mediterranean region, Africa and the Balkans, and Japan wanted to be the master of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. But that is not to say that the policy of appeasement was a bad policy. In fact, it was actually a pretty good one. The policy of appeasement happens to be one of the first few instances where major nations like Britain and France actually tried to appease other nations instead of declaring war on them. But this policy of appeasement was interpreted in a different manner by the Axis powers. You see, the Axis powers interpreted the policy of appeasement as a policy of weakness exhibited by the Allied nations. Where the public residing in the Allied nations started to sympathize for the discontentment among the Germans and Italians, Mussolini and Hitler spun this around and told his own public that the Allied nations are actually scared of what Italy and Germany are now capable of doing. You see, the Axis powers therefore uses relaxation of the Allied nations as a sort of gate pass. A gate pass to expand or conquer any nations it wants and to do whatever it wants to do. And it knew that they will not be stopped by the Allied nations. And thus, they exploited the policy of appeasement for what they perceived it as its weakness. The Allied nations did not stop the expansions of the Axis powers, fearing that such a conflict or confrontation could cause a war. But little did they know that by not stopping them, they were giving the Axis powers enough impetus to cause another war themselves. Finally, in trying to control the rising tide of communism, the Allies allowed the growth of a much more violent and aggressive set of ideologies in Italy, Germany, and Japan that would go on to destroy the world and plunge it into a disastrous war. The policy of appeasement, therefore, created more problems for the Allied powers than it created solutions. We can see in this illustration how the Allied powers are actually causing their own deaths. You see in this illustration how the Allied powers are holding the guillotine in their own hands, the guillotine being the policy of appeasement. And we can understand how the Allied powers were themselves responsible to some extent for their own crises and for them not being able to avert the Second World War eventually breaking out. Over here we see a cartoon illustration which showcases the problem with the policy of appeasement. Over here we see a person is trying to assure Uncle Sam, who is the personification of the United States of America. This person is telling that, relax Sam, I assure you, at the express turns off right here. And then we see that a very speeding train is approaching them. And the speeding train is a train of Nazism. It's approaching towards them speedily. And over here the person is convinced that this speeding train would turn at this junction where the rails are becoming narrower. Over here, the train can go as fast as it wants, and this person is convinced that at this appeasement junction, the Nazi train will slow down and move into a much narrower rail. Do you think that would be the case, or do you think that the train will continue speeding along the track, crushing the both of them in process? That was the problem with the Allied mindset. They thought that with the policy of appeasement, they could easily turn and change aggressive ideologies like Nazism and fascism and make them peaceful. That was never to be the case. What the policy of appeasement really did is to open the war to Second World War rather than closing it shut. Eventually, the Second World War broke out when the expansions of the Axis powers continued till a point when it could no longer go unchecked. In this lesson, we were able to trace how the policy of appeasement was a crucial cause behind the Second World War. In the subsequent lessons, we shall continue our discussion on the various other causes behind the outbreak of the Second World War. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it is rewarding too. So register for free now.